Well, I'm delighted to be invited to speak to the UTS alumni here in London. And I've been asked a few questions. First of all, where did I grow up? Well, I was born and bred in Adelaide, South Australia. It's my hometown. And when I was growing up, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I really had a love of technology and electronics. And I remember about 6 years old, I was playing with some lamps and joining them in different ways and writing down in my logbook how they glowed different brightness levels depending on how they were connected. So I suppose I've always had that inquisitive mind and always been interested in technology. What I do outside of my day job is I like to teach other people what I know. I do a lot of public speaking. I'm a member of a group called Speakers for Schools, and we go around and talk to schools. These are Year 8s, Year 9, 10, 11 and matric leaving level students that wouldn't normally be able to attract a speaker from the business community, and so I help out with that. I looked at an engineering degree because being inquisitive about technology, I thought that was the next best step. In fact, I attempted a science degree at Flinders University and I failed 2 years in a row. And when I go and give career advice, I say that it's okay to fail things. Actually, you need to go after your passion. And so failing 2 years of a science degree, I realised that probably engineering was the right thing for me. But once I'd studied engineering, once I'd moved to Sydney, more about that in a moment, I thought, well, how do I further my education? So I approached UTS and I was accepted to do an MBA in e-business management at UTS. And so that's what I did, and I really learned a lot about business. I'd been in my career 4 or 5, 6 years by that stage, so I knew what it was like to go to work. I wasn't fresh out of school, and I was really struck by the 30 or so other people in my class. Every week, every time we met for lectures, we all were looking at similar business problems that we had in our own career. What sort of advice would I give to students about looking to graduate and go into the workforce? I think it is so competitive now. I do a lot of speeches to schools through Speakers for Schools, to university level students, to graduates. And I say to them that while you all look fantastic, you all look wonderful, you all look exactly the same to me as an employer. And I encourage them to rise above the noise and do something different. So back when I was studying, both my undergraduate and my postgraduate, we didn't have social media. And so I had to get myself known by going to events and networking events. But nowadays with social media, it's just so easy to get known. So I would encourage people to have a voice, have an opinion, start a blog, go on social media, go on LinkedIn, and actually let others know what you know, and then they will actually come looking for you. So after I completed my MBA, I had a number of different positions. I worked for Telstra, I worked for Optus in Australia. I have a connection to UTS because the job that got me to London was actually a couple of UTS academics had designed some very smart location-based services technology. And my first customer living in Sydney was Vodafone in Newbury here in the UK. And so I was on a plane every 3 weeks from Sydney to London, and they said, why don't you move to the UK and service the clients from over there? And that's what I did back in 2006. I do a lot of public speaking, as I said, and I've been doing keynotes since 1999. And more lately, I've styled myself as a practical futurist. And often people say, well, what's the difference between a futurist and a practical futurist? And the best way to describe that is thinking of my favourite futurist, Arthur C. Clarke. He was a co-author of 2001 Space Odyssey. And in 1974, he was asked by an Australian journalist what the world would be like in the year 2001. And if you watch his answer, he got it pretty right. He said that we would have a computer in our own home, we would be able to work remotely. He even addressed the societal impacts of technology taking over our lives. So as a practical futurist, I give clients near-term practical advice about what they should be doing. And I often challenge myself to say that I want you to leave this room with 2 or 3 things that you're going to do differently tomorrow or next week as a result. Some of the most common questions I get versus when I started speaking in 1999, back then it was, do we need a web presence? Do we need to be online? And of course we know how the story ends. Nowadays it's more a case of, should we be on social media? Do we need an innovation team? How do we stay ahead and make sure we're not disrupted? So I get those sort of questions all the time from clients. And in terms of the practical advice I give clients, I can honestly say that people put it into practice because The day after a talk a few months ago, I had someone tweet me to say they had been in the audience the day before, they enjoyed what I was saying, and they'd actually put the advice I'd given into play, and they were talking about it at their team meeting. And that's happened several times. In fact, I'm doing a talk next month to a large insurer, and I will actually end the talk by inviting the CEOs from around the world for this company to sign up to 3 things that they're going to do differently, and they'll be held to that in their objectives. So I really do like to know that people are taking my advice. And often I'll come off stage and people will say, that was a great talk, and it's very flattering because, I think I'm a good speaker. And so I deflect the flattery and I say, but what will you do differently as a result? And they go, that's a really good question. And I then know whether they've actually listened to my advice and they're going to do something differently the next week. What's my ultimate vision? What do I hope to achieve or inspire others? I mean, I stay up to date. I'm a technologist. I understand the practical implications of this new technology, but I want to inspire others to stay ahead of the curve. Don't wait for things to happen. Don't wait for innovation. Actually start doing it now. I often say that you need to disrupt yourself, otherwise you're going to get disrupted. I get asked all the time how I stay current. There is so much to look at. And I read vigorously. By the time I've got up in the morning, had my first cup of coffee, I've scanned the UK papers, I've scanned the Australian papers, I've read the Financial Times, I've looked at some of the tech blogs, I have alerts all the time letting me know what's going on. I save things. I use a Read It Now service called Pocket, getpocket.com. And that allows me to save things that I've seen to look at later, and I often use those in my talks. I'm always taking pictures of signs, I'm always taking screenshots of ads that I've seen, and in fact I was doing a presentation preparation this morning for a talk I'm doing next week in Rotterdam, and I was actually pulling some of the things that I'd taken screenshots of weeks ago into my presentation. So I just read, I question, I try and stay ahead, I try and sign up to all these new services. I've been online since 1983 with dial-up modems and bulletin boards. I've been on Twitter since 2007, LinkedIn since 2004. I really try and stay ahead of what's out there. The impact of technology, though, is not just geeky stuff and the new tech and AI and blockchain, IoT. Every time I talk about disruption and technology, it comes back to one thing, and that's culture. At the end of the day, human beings are the people that are delivering these services, and we rely on humans, and we will always rely on humans. But organisations I see that struggle with the introduction of new technologies because their culture isn't ready for it, and it generally happens at the top table. The top table have been there a long time, they haven't been able to keep up with the technology, they're not sure how to communicate these changes, and it's a cultural impact more often than not that is holding companies back from not being disrupted. I really love when people disagree with me. I started debating when I was at school, grade 5, I started debating back then. So I'll do a talk and I'll often say, well, who disagrees with me? I want people to actually disagree, because otherwise it's just, yes, we believe everything you're saying. And when I'm on stage, if I'm on a panel or I'm on by myself, I often try and be a little bit controversial to stimulate discussion, because there's nothing worse than everyone going, yeah, we'll just agree with you. And so I love it when people disagree with me. I respect their right, but also like to be heard and like to be able to put my point of view back to them and actually see whether they agree. And so in a public forum or one-on-one, I don't mind a disagreement. I prefer that. Sometimes people say, I've got to embrace this change or you'll perish. Like I said before, if you don't disrupt yourself, you're going to get disrupted. And so rather than waiting for the Amazons, Googles, Netflixes of the world to come and eat your lunch, what are you doing to stay ahead of what they're doing? A good example, here in the UK, the BBC is under a massive threat from Netflix. Now, the BBC is funded by £150 a year licence fee. So in effect, we all subscribe to the BBC at £150 a year, whether we like it or not. And if you don't pay the licence fee, you get fined. It's one of the most unique funding mechanisms in the world for a public broadcaster. And the BBC and the other public broadcasts are very worried because people are now going to Netflix. And I pay my £10 a month for Netflix and I don't have any ads, and I see what I want when I want it. So I think that we're going to see a lot of disruption from the usual suspects. We're going to see disruption from across all areas. And some of the things happening this year, certainly here in Europe, are what I call regulated disruption. There's the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which comes into play just in a few weeks here in the UK and across Europe. And that is a fundamental change in how companies deal with private data and private information. And the other thing that's happening is called open banking. There are a number of open banking projects happening around the world where data from banks is being opened up through APIs or application programming interfaces so that end users and smart fintechs, startups can actually use that. So I think we're going to see a lot of disruption and consumers ultimately will really benefit. Now, Facebook recently has been in the news a lot because of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and only a few days ago Cambridge Analytica said that they were going to close down. And when I first heard what CA had done, I thought that's actually quite savvy marketing to use profile information to be able to target people for advertising. And the more I looked into it, I realised that they weren't going about it in a very ethical way. And so the Guardian's expose, the newspaper here in the UK, have really dug very, very deep and caused a company to go out of business. I think Facebook has a few questions to answer though, because they let this happen, and I think the GDPR could not be better timed in that consumers will now have their data and privacy rights protected. But I think it's up to the consumer to realise the value of their data. And I think things like GDPR, things like open banking will really help consumers realise that value of their data very soon. So I've been away from Australia for 12 years now, and I stay in touch with what's going on. I read the newspapers every day. I catch up with things like the Sydney Morning Herald. And I've been watching very closely the National Broadband Network, the NBN. I've actually used the NBN in some examples here when we talk about superfast broadband. And I found it fascinating. The ABC, I think it was a Four Corners program in Australia that looked at Dubbo, where on one side of the road they have fibre to the premise, very fast internet. On the other side they have fibre to the node or fibre to the cabinet, and it's a lot slower. And what real estate agents were finding was people were not asking just what school is it close to, is it close to transport, but is the property I'm about to buy or rent, has it got fast broadband? And this means there's now a digital divide. And 10 years ago, when I heard that the then Labor government was going to drop $45 billion on fibre to every home, I thought that is almost unrealistic because the technology needed, the infrastructure needed is going to be out of this world. But here in London, where I live, I have 100 megabits up and 100 megabits down. And if I go somewhere else and it's slower, I think, why am I putting up with that? So I think the NBN is going to be overtaken by even 4G at the moment, 5G services. So we may find people wanting to use mobile-powered wireless broadband rather than the connected broadband directly to their home. And people talk about unwinding and this thing called the digital detox. And I suppose I'm the worst person to talk about digital detox because I'm always connected. And I would have to admit that, yes, I'm somewhat addicted to social media. I'm addicted to what's going on online. I find it very hard to shut down and to wind down. But I think even I have to admit that it isn't healthy to be always wanting to see what's going on. The social networks have kind of admitted that they've built in this dopamine hit, that the reason that you see someone's liked your post or the little icon goes red and there are 35 people that have liked or read your message, it is a dopamine hit. And they've designed it to be addictive, so you come back and you see ads. And so while it's very easy to say we're just going to switch this off, I think we're now in a society where there's an expectation that every time your phone buzzes, it could be important. Think about just 10 years ago when your phone buzzed, it was probably an SMS and that was it. Now it can be anything. It can be an Amazon parcels being delivered. It can be the latest weather update. It can be a BBC News update. It can be a stock price. So I think, unfortunately, we have become addicted to this always-on technology. And finally, the sort of areas that I hang around, if you wanted to find me, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. I like posting, I think, informative, insightful comments on LinkedIn. Find me at Andrew Grill. I'm on Twitter at Andrew Grill. I put things there. Twitter hasn't been as prolific more recently because I think LinkedIn has taken over. I've been blogging since 2000 at londoncalling.co, where you can find my latest thinking. But I also contribute and I speak a lot. So if you want to find me, if you can't come to the alumni event in London, then do find me online, and I'd love to engage with you. I'd love to have that healthy discussion where you might disagree with me.